welcome. This is the lecture on fairness in machine learning. So in this lecture, our focus is going to be on the fairness requirement or objective to achieve the trustworthy machine learning or AI umbrella or objective that we've been discussing throughout the course. So the idea here is in relation to fairness, what we're going to look at is we want to make sure that the decisions that are made by machine learning models are not there to amplify bias, because as we know, we live in a world that is plagued with a lot of discriminatory historical background as far as data collection, data curation, data processing, and decision making. So we don't. So what we want to avoid, if possible, is we don't want this discriminatory practices to flow into the algorithmic foundations and applications of machine learning. Okay. So as a starter or as a preamble, before we get into the actual content of the lecture, the starting point, as I tried to point out, is whenever we talk about fairness or discrimination or bias, we're talking about the fact that the world we live in is a world where we have this pervasive inequality that has been rolling throughout history. There has been a lot of oppression in different contexts and discrimination, right? So these are the realities we live in, and this is what the world we live in is struggling with. So when we discuss about fairness in the context of machine learning, we are not necessarily obsessed with just the technical aspects of machine learning. We are stepping out of the comfort zone of just the formalism of machine learning and trying to see what are the societal impacts, the actual impacts that decisions made by algorithms in general, but machine learning models in particular are going to look like as it relates to effects on human life when we make decisions based on machine learning models. So in addition, I think to basically contextualize what we're talking about here, as we use machine learning to somehow formalize and also scale and accelerate processes in this world that we live in, which is plagued with pervasive inequality, oppression, and discrimination, we are basically running a danger of perpetuating or propagating the existing patterns of injustice, right? So that's sort of the starting point of our discussion here, with not necessarily, tied to the technical definition of fairness, as you would point out, as you would see. It's really hard to technically define what fairness is given the complex world we live in. Okay, but at the same time, we don't want to declare that, okay, we give up and there is no hope in terms of achieving fairness in the context of machine learning, but rather there is some, somewhat fragile opportunity to basically revisit decision making in various domains and try to reform these existing processes in a better way, so to make life better for people, right? So that's sort of the preamble or the context under which we're going to discuss fairness in machine learning or AI. But the literature around fairness and the discourse around fairness is not purely technical. That yes, there is some technical element, there is some statistical element to it, as we will discuss. But there's also literature that came out over the years that puts fairness, discrimination, and oppression, and looks at it from the lens of different socioeconomic perspectives. For example, race. This book by Roha Benjamin, Race After Technology, is one good example of that. The other book is Automating Inequality. This also looked at how big tools like high-tech tools profile, police, and punish the poor. And there's another book called Artificial Unintelligence, which basically highlights the important issue of, okay, AI models, robots, and machine learning models included, they may not get things, or they may not understand the world the way people understand them. that might have implications on marginalized groups. And the book by Sophia Noble, which talks about Safia Noble, which talks about algorithms of oppression. Of course, this focuses on search engines, but it also shows how algorithmic decisions like ranking of web pages on search engines are tied with the actual discriminatory practices that we have over the years. And more recent books, specifically Weapons of Mass Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, which also highlights, this how this big data boom basically increases inequality and threatens, the foundations of modern day democracy and other social services. And there's also this book by Kate Crawford, which is entitled Atlas of AI, which also paints an interesting picture as to, what AI fairness and ethics should fare against, accuracy of models and things like that. And very recently, Joy, who is also a well-known figure in the space of ethical and fair AI, and who was also one of the pioneers in terms of exposing how facial recognition systems are discriminatory against different genders and races, etc., has come out with a very interesting book called Unmasking AI, which basically kind of ties her mission and her journey of how she came about to know the issues and the pitfalls on AI models as it relates to, for example, social issues like fairness, etc. Right. So these are sort of the books and the material that you can use if you're into this area and interested in exploring more beyond the technical gymnastic that we'll try to do to achieve fairness. So with that preamble, the goals in the lecture are, first, we're going to talk about, discrimination being important in consequential decision-making settings. We will definitely be not exhaustive because, fairness is a very broad term. And if we talk about addressing discrimination, it goes well beyond technical solutions. So this lecture definitely excludes many other forms of injustice. Even the very notion of unfairness may not be fully covered because it's impossible. And admittedly, this is also going to be a US-centric perspective because in the laws and the fairness regulations that we're going to talk about are going to be biased towards the United States. But if you're watching this lecture or if you're looking through the materials in this lecture and doing the same or teaching or trying to understand this in another part of the world, you better try to contextualize some of the material here. So it's going to be US biased. And part of the reason is that I am based in the United States and I'm teaching this in a US university. And of course, we'll look at formal methods, formal models and frameworks for basically formalizing fairness criteria and how far we can go with statistical fairness criteria. And we'll look at some established ways of doing fairness analysis. And as I said, of course, this lecture wouldn't include everything in terms of like injustice and fairness, etc. And of course, it leaves room for what we call non-technical interventions. For example, we're not going to cover about things that are related to policy and so on, and regulations, etc. Okay, so discrimination versus machine learning, because whenever we talk about fairness, we're talking about discrimination, right? So the presence of discrimination, the pervasiveness of discrimination. The question of fairness comes when there is discrimination, for sure. But when we relate this with the actual notion of machine learning, specifically supervised machine learning models like trained for classification, the act of discriminating between different classes is a key concept or key central concept in machine learning models, specifically classifiers. So you might wonder and ask this question of, isn't discrimination the point of machine learning in the first place? So why are we surprised when machine learning models discriminate between people, right? On the surface, this question seems a very reasonable question, but our concern is with what we call unjustified basis for differentiation. Okay, yes, we want a classifier to precisely discriminate between different classes. So if I train a classifier to discriminate between cats and dogs, yes, I want it to be a perfect classifier, and I don't want it to make errors. But that's not the point here. The point here is when the data points are humans and the decisions are going to affect people's lives, then that is what we call unjustified basis for differentiation. For example, we could have this practical irrelevance of a machine learning model that would use sexual orientation to decide employment decisions. Or you could also have this moral irrelevance of discrimination when disability status is front and center in a hiring process or in making a decision about as to whether you're going to hire somebody or not, right? So that is the rationale, that is a context we're coming from when we talk about discrimination versus machine learning. And the other important thing that we have to keep in mind when we talk about fairness and discrimination in the sense of machine learning is discrimination is not a general concept. It's not something that you can define universally and say, okay, we have to stick to this definition. It is domain specific because this is concerned with important opportunities that affect people's lives. So discrimination in a housing sector is different from discrimination in healthcare. The other thing is discrimination is also group specific. And the idea behind this is this has to do with this socially salient categories that have served as a basis for unjustified and systematically adverse treatment in the past. So there's our history. If we look back a history of any nation, and in particular the United States, there is a great deal of history and evidence for discrimination, specifically around people of color, and more specifically, African Americans. So in the United States, as I said, if every time I cite the law or regulations here, I'm going to be biased to the United States for the reason I just stated earlier. There are this set of domains called regulated domains in the United States based on the United States laws. For instance, there is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. There is this Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then in 1972, there was an amendment to that for education. And we do have employment, which also originates from the Civil Rights Act, housing, the Fair Housing Act, public accommodation, again, originates from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this extends to, other more recent technology-driven regulations like advertising and marketing, etc. And the list obviously doesn't include or excludes a complex set of or landscape of laws that regulate the government, the United States government, like the three branches of the government, the federal government as a whole, and also the different states that exist within the framework of the federal government in the US. In the United States, we have what we call legally recognized protected classes because we want to avoid decisions to be made based on this important social dimensions, such as race of people, color, skin color of people, sex, origin, national origin of people, citizenship of people, age of people, pregnancy status, family status, disability status, veteran status, and genetic information, right? So these are protected, legally protected. So there is a law. So if you think some decision that is made against you is based on one or more of this, you have the legal right to challenge these decisions and to ask for explanations and justifications. Okay, so that's in theory, we do have this legally recognized protected classes that you shouldn't be using to make decisions based on these rules, this protected classes. So in the United States, we do have these two legal doctrines. One is called the disparate treatment. So the idea here is when you're doing, for example, purposeful consideration of a group membership, for example, you purposely consider whether someone is Black or white or female or male or so this has to do with intentional discrimination without consideration of group membership. For example, if you're asked to consider group membership, for instance, in the case of affirmative actions for college admission and things like that, although that has been knocked down by the Supreme Court as of now, but if you do that, the goal here is procedural fairness. So there is some procedure that says either consider or not consider a specific protected class or group membership, and you would conform to that procedure, and you would be fulfilling procedure of fairness. The other kind of doctrine is called disparate treatment or impact. Disparate impact. And the idea here is to basically get to this situation where you have an avoidable or an unjustified harm, and this could happen possibly indirectly. And the goal is what we call distributive justice, right? So procedural fairness versus distributed justice. And the idea is basically to minimize differences in outcomes. For example, if you are dealing with two groups of people, let's say females and males, you want to balance the outcomes so that one is not adversely affected compared to the other. Okay, so there are those two legal doctrines. So the fairness mechanism that you're going to implement or incorporate into the machine learning pipeline could be affected by which doctrine you're going to follow. Okay, no law of any land is perfect because laws are designed by humans and they are also based on some context, historical context of the country, political philosophy, and other things, right? So there are some caveats of the law in the context of the United States. For example, anti-discrimination laws, there are anti-discrimination laws, but the law does not reflect one single moral theory behind it. And the reason is legislations, by their very nature, are often responses to civil rights movements, as it is true, for example, in the United States. And these are hard fought through decades of activism by people who are concerned about this or who are directly affected by this. And the law does not really give us what we call the fairness definition that we can basically plug and formalize and, hit the road to operationalize this definition. There is no such thing as a fairness definition. If that was the case, we wouldn't be having this lecture or this discussion. We'd just pick the fairness definition, plug it into our pipeline, wherever it is in the machine learning pipeline, and we move on. So that brings us to this notion of fairness through unawareness, right? So it doesn't really make a big of a sense when you say, oh, I removed or I excluded sensitive attributes, and as a result, this would just cure any fairness concerns or fairness pitfalls, and you would be good to go, right? So removing sensitive attributes is not going to solve the problem, and sometimes it could even make the problems worse or amplify the issue, as we will see later. Just to kind of reinforce what I'm saying here, this was when Amazon rolled out the same-day delivery service, and they were tracking across cities, big cities in the United States, because that's where the market is, right? And they were looking at, the coverage of the same-day delivery in the US, in big cities like Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, New York City, and Washington, D.C. as well. And there was a very interesting observation by Bloomberg, where there is in Boston, there is this one county in Boston that is grayed out, okay? So everything blue, it basically in this map shows, in the cities shows, the coverage, like a full coverage is there. But there is one hole in the city of Boston And this article from Bloomberg was trying to understand what is going on there. So, of course, again, I'm saying this in relation to what I talked about, this fairness through an awareness notion, right? So the fact that you claim that you are not using this sensitive attribute doesn't really set you free from any blame. Okay, so the assumption and the conclusion at the moment was perhaps Amazon was just predicting the number of purchases, which basically correlates with the affluence of the neighborhood. So neighborhoods which are better off financially were signing up for the services, and there is coverage in those areas. But that area, that the Roxbury County in Boston, is historically known for being predominantly low income, mostly African American, and so on, which basically correlates with race, right? So there is a reason why that part is grayed out and there's no coverage, because people didn't sign up, they don't purchase things online, they don't have the financial means to do that. Therefore, the story on the ground is not coming out of the blue. It's correlated with the demographic makeup of that location in Boston. Okay, so as we know, this number of purchases and signing up for this kind of services correlates with your financial muscle or financial capacity, and this correlates with race in the United States, unfortunately, because of the historical discrimination and this historical biases that we went through. And of course, Amazon certainly did not look at their customers' race when they built this product. So basically, when they looked at and did this analysis, they never looked at the race of the people who are signing up for this. But as you can see, it's indirectly correlated with race. And something that kind of connects back to what we observed for the Amazon same-day delivery case is also this housing housing mortgage or lending for housing data that relied on a map in Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. And in the past, there was this discriminatory practices where lenders would basically highlight different counties or different parts of the city with different colors. For example, the red color here, the legend shows that this is hazardous. So hazardous in terms of lending. So anyone living in this red coded regions is a high risk borrower. And that usually is correlated with predominantly colored people of color, and specifically African Americans, given the demographic of Philadelphia that we know. Okay, so there is some historical link with the present day observations as to like fairness to past discriminatory practices. So it's not like it's coming out of the blue. There is some historical context behind this as well. Okay, now there is, so fairness through unawareness doesn't work. And the other thing is the fact that you say we do not consider, for example, Amazon didn't consider the race of their customers, but if you simply claim that I do not consider race in my data, or generally if we claim that I don't consider that sensitive attribute in my data, this is not going to be a valid argument, right? So there is correlation, as I showed you through these two examples, one from history and the other from a recent history, right? Which seem to correlate well. You can't really say, oh, I'm not looking at your race, I'm not looking at your gender, whatever, right? There is some indirect link between the outcome of the algorithm and this socioeconomic dimensions such as race, age, and so on. So the question then is, what should we do instead? So if fairness through unawareness doesn't work, and the fact that we don't look at the features of this sensitive attribute is not a valid argument, we should do something about it. We should do something pragmatic, right? So the solution that we have as of now is, can we rely on some well-formed formalizations of fairness criteria, when we do classification, right? So that's basically what we're going to spend more of the time of the lecture on for today. Okay, so before we get there, first, I want to kind of contextualize or put into perspective where do we see bias in the machine learning pipeline, right? So I was simply talking about decisions and classifications, but it is worth looking at the whole pipeline and point out where bias could happen. The short answer for this is bias could happen anywhere in the pipeline, but to be specific, it starts with historical bias. So historical bias when data is collected or data is generated. So that is one root cause for bias, but it's not the only cause, because in the current discourse as to fairness and bias in machine learning, there is this misconception that everybody would, well, not everybody, but most people would attribute this fairness pitfalls or biases to just data. So they simply say, oh, data is biased, therefore don't be surprised if the model is biased. That is true, but not entirely true, or that data is not the only reason, okay? And the reason why is it's basically the way we open this lecture, right? So we say due to pervasive inequality, oppression, and discrimination based on this demographic dimensions like race, gender, religion, whatever, there is historical bias. The other thing is what we call representation or sampling bias. When you do population selection, when you do data sampling, because it doesn't matter whether there was no historical bias. Let's say the data generation and collection was perfect, okay? Let's assume that for a moment. Then the way you sample data could introduce bias or could amplify bias, right? So this has to do with, for example, demographic bias, geographic bias, behavioral bias, temporal bias, and so on. That's not all. We also have what we call measurement bias when you do data extraction or measurement of data, right? So for example, if you look at medical devices that are used to measure different vital signs and take a lot of data and scans, etc., then whatever data that we're going to collect is going to depend on how good, how precise this measurement devices are and how people calibrate these devices and so on. And this would propagate into, for example, how do we choose to measure? What features do we extract? Do we leave out some features? Do we incorporate some other features? How are these features going to work well or not well for different groups of people? The units that we use, the representation, etc. When we do machine learning, it's oftentimes the case that we do some sort of pre-processing. And when you do pre-processing, you're applying some pre-processing functions, and this could introduce bias, right? Because you have to set some hyperparameters for pre-processing. So the pre-processing method, the parameters that you use, for example, when you pre-process an image, you could resize it with some ratio. You could crop it, you could change the intensity, the color, etc. So all these play into the notion of bias. And we have aggregation bias. In machine learning, the key component when you train a model is the optimization, right? When you do optimization, there is a great deal of parameter selection and parameter tuning that would affect the outcome of the training, which is going to be the model that decisions are going to be based on. Therefore, the choice of objective functions like the loss function you choose, the optimizer that you choose, the model architecture details, every little detail matters here, hyperparameters and so on. And finally, once you have the model, even if everything else was fine, so historical bias was non-existent, no representation bias, no measurement bias, no pre-processing bias, no aggregation bias, let's suppose, okay, this is very idealistic. And then you get to the evaluation, okay? Well, in evaluation, when you do validation and testing, you could end up with bias as well, where because your evaluation and validation is going to be based on some benchmarks, some data set that you would use, and post-processing of this model outputs could also play into the notion of bias. So as you can see, bias could be introduced in any spot of the data processing pipeline in machine learning, starting from data generation or collection up until to the the model evaluation part. So it is across the board, across the whole pipeline. So every time we think about bias and also fairness in the context of machine learning, we have to be mindful of the fact that bias could manifest or could be introduced in anywhere in the pipeline. Okay, so with that background on where bias could happen in the machine learning pipeline, now let's talk about as we said here on what to do about because we don't consider that in our data is never a valid argument. Therefore, what should we do, right? So we say formalization of fairness criteria, and we talked about the fact that these are the different junctions in the data processing or machine learning pipeline that bias could show up. So the formal work on fairness in decision making, the history is that long before machine learning became a big thing and a popular thing as we have it today, people have done statistics people, economics people, they have done this fairness criteria, statistical fairness criteria on data that has to do with economics, education, and so on. In computer science or generally in computing, this happened mostly post 2010 because there is this explosive increase in work related to fairness and machine learning since 2016. And this is correlated with, the incidents that we saw, the fairness pitfall or the biases that we saw with facial recognition systems, models being used for, law enforcement and many sensitive domains. And you might wonder why today, why the urgency? Because, machine learning is everywhere, AI is everywhere, pervasive, and it can very easily reach many people, millions, and oftentimes billions of people. So the impact of the algorithmic decisions is huge. And machine learning also fuels a lot of adoption and motivates some technical problems. So it also forces us to kind of revisit fundamental questions that we have been trying to answer through like vanilla statistics in the past, where we don't have this notion of intelligence or learning incorporated. Okay, so for the formalization part, here is how we're going to do it. Okay, so we're going to assume that we have data described by covariates or features, basically. And we'll use X for that. And there is outcome variable Y. And this is oftentimes a binary variable, like a yes or no, like in the sense of binary classification. And we also call this a target variable or label. And our goal is to predict Y from X. So given X, we want to predict Y. And for that, we will be using a supervised machine learning or a classifier that would produce what we call a score function R, which is R of X, right? So given X, you run it through the function and it gives you the score. And based on the score, we want to make binary decisions according to the threshold rule, where the decision is going to be, for example, 1 when the score is greater than some threshold T, okay? As we do it in binary classification for example, linear models like logistic regression or even neural networks, right? So the side note here is that you can think of this random variables as random variables in the same probability space. So the population is, for example, of individuals or people who come with some attributes that are embedded in the feature vector X, and part of that could be, the feature vector X, and we could also have additional features that have to do with like the protected classes that we talked about, such as age, race, and gender, and things like that. Okay, so that's going to be our setup for the formalization of statistical fairness. One question you might ask is, where does the scoring function come from? For the purpose of this lecture, it doesn't really matter, but conceptually, the score could come from different sources. So it could be based on parametric model of the data, right? So X and Y, For instance, you can do the likelihood ratio test. Or it could be non-parametric score, such as the bias optimal score, where R is the expectation of Y given X. Or in the most common case, today we do machine learning. So it could be learned from labeled data using supervised learning, such as deep neural networks, okay? So for our purpose, it doesn't really matter. We can safely assume that, okay, the score function is set, and we're just getting the score out of it and processing the score to get the decision, and then analyze the decision based on the sensitive attributes. Okay, another background that we need to kind of streamline the discussion that follows is this idea of decision theory, or the confusion metrics, okay? So the confusion metrics, this is familiar in the space of like anomaly detection, or evaluating machine learning models effectiveness. So what we have is the outcome Y over here. The outcome Y okay, so sorry, I'm just setting up my slides again. All right, so we have outcome Y over here, and the decision D on this. So vertically we have outcome Y, and horizontally we have decision D. So when the expected outcome is 1, and the decision is 1, this is true positive. The expected outcome is 1, and the decision is 0, this is false negative, because our expected outcome is a positive outcome is 1. When the outcome is 0 and the decision is 0, this is a true negative. And when the outcome is 0 and the decision is 1, this is called a false positive. And you can also put this slightly differently in terms of a probability. So the true positive rate is going to be the probability that the decision is 1 given the outcome is 1. The false positive rate is the probability that the decision is 1 given the outcome is 0. The true negative rate is the probability that the decision is 0 given the outcome is 0. And lastly, the false negative rate is the probability that the decision is 0 given the outcome is Y. Okay, so that's sort of the background metric that we're going to use, which is decision theory 101 in every sense. Okay, now statistical fairness criteria. So given the confusion metrics we talked about, the metrics we talked about, and also the variables that the notation that we have defined for features, the outcome, the scoring function, and the decision threshold, how do we set up the statistical fairness criteria? There's one more thing we have to add, and that is we have to introduce this random variable A to encode what we call membership status in the protected class. So this A is going to capture the protected class such as race, gender, and so on. And the goal is to equalize different statistical quantities involving group membership, right? So that's our statistical fairness criteria. And the idea of doing this statistical fairness criteria actually it predates, the current boom in machine learning. It goes to the 60s, where Annie Cleary looked at this from the educational data point of view for educational testing, right? So based on this statistical fairness criteria over here, we're going to review about 3 common criteria that are used in statistics that we could use or apply for machine learning, for basically ensuring statistical fairness criteria in machine learning. And the first is what we call equalizing acceptance rate. So based on the metrics that we talked about, what we call equal positive rate is for any 2 groups, A and B. So for example, A could be male and B could be female. Okay, so male and female. So what we want to require, so the requirement to the equal positive rate is the probability that the decision is 1 when it is a male, or A is male, right? Is supposed to be the same as the probability that the decision is 1 when it is also a female, right? When the protected class is a female. So the idea in general is we want the acceptance rate to be equal for all groups, in this case, both groups A and B, male and female. So when we generalize this idea, what we're saying in one sentence is we require D to be independent of A, okay? We want the decision to be independent of what group the person belongs to. And that's ideal, right? If the group membership is not taken into account, then the decision is based on other things, then it's very, well, it's less likely that the decision will be biased. Okay, don't take this word as a final word until we see everything else in this lecture, but that's the whole here. But before we go any further, this criteria that we just set out here, the equalizing acceptance rate criteria, may not work all the time. So why? Why this doesn't rule out, unfairness, unfair practices? So here's the situation. So you could make good or informed decisions in one group, or you could make poor or arbitrary decisions in other groups. So that is a problem. And you might wonder, how about equalizing the positive rate, right? So if the positive rate is equalized for everybody, would that solve the problem? So this can happen on its own if we have less data or poor data. So some of the parameters are out of your control sometimes. So it's just the nature of the data. For example, there is less data for females versus males, or the quality of the data is poor for males as compared to for females, even if the quantity or the number of data points are the same, right? And this is true. This has been observed in the past in medical data sets. For example, the old Framingham risk score, well-known risk score for coronary heart disease, was created on a cohort of white men only in the old days. And then it was used to predict, heart disease probability for other patients, females and other kinds of races as well. So the idea is, how do we solve this kind of issues? Because a positive pole could be false positive or true positive. So how about we measure, we equalize false positive and true positive? And the moral intuition behind this is you shouldn't be matching, true positives in one group and false positives in another, because you could be making this good informed decisions in one group and poor on the other, right? So that's sort of the precautionary note about the statistical fairness criteria, the equalizing acceptance rate here. On the surface, it looks very interesting, and you might feel like you're doing the right thing, but it has also, it is affected by the kind of data, the imbalance between the two groups, and also the quality of the data as well, and what you are measuring. So if you're measuring one thing for one group and measuring something else for another group, it doesn't really matter if the quantities are equalized. In an attempt to kind of achieve independence, the literature in fairness and machine learning has gone through a bunch of episodes, and one of them, notable episodes, is what we call representation learning. So fair representation learning, okay? Representation learning is a main topic of deep learning, but then now we have a question of fair representation learning. So the general idea is to use some deep learning tricks, such as adversarial training or adversarial learning, as we saw in the adversarial examples lecture, to train a representation of the data that is independent of the group membership. So the way we are doing this is you're going to project the representation of the data X into this representation Z, where Z is independent of the protected class A. And when we do this, we want to achieve two goals. First, the independence goal. And the second goal is we also want to make sure that this projection of the data representation is not going to hurt the utility of the model, right? So while representing original data as well as possible, right? So we're trying to achieve these two goals. So that's one way to look at achieving independence without compromising the utility of the model. So that's on equalizing positive rates. The other fairness criteria, statistical fairness criteria, is what we call equalizing error rates. So for any two groups, A and B, again, you can take A equals male, and B equals female. Okay. So what we're trying to do is the probability that the decision is Y when the outcome is 0 and the person is a female is the same as the probability that the decision is 1 when the outcome is 0 and the person is a female. Okay, so this is a the false positive formula that we have looked at in the covariance matrix. So this is basically equal false positive rate. And oppositely, you can also do the equal false negative rate, where the probability of the decision being 0 given Y equals 1 when the person is a male is the same as the probability that the decision is 0 given Y equals 1 when the person is a female. Okay, so the generalization here is we are requiring D to be independent of A given Y. So there is additional constraint as compared to the equal positive rate, where we're simply saying we want to require D to be independent of A. But here, in addition, we're saying D is independent of A given Y. Okay, so this also makes for a score. So you can say we require R to be independent of A given Y. The idea applies because the decision is based on a threshold of the score, right? So conceptually, it doesn't change anything. Interestingly, error rate parity is what we call a post hoc criteria, right? So you're going to constrain this on top of, when you compute the outcome and look at false positive rate and false negative rate. So at decision time, the decision maker really doesn't know who is false positive, who is positive and negative instance, right? So in retrospect, somebody can collect a group of positive instances and a group of negative instances and check how they were classified just to debug whether this is working or not. But the group differences in this kind of post hoc audits, because that's what we're doing, often become very unfair against people. And a better way to look at this is to look at, for example, what we call the ROC curve, which is typical in data analysis and machine learning, right? So what we're doing here is we're going to plot false positive rate versus, oh, okay, the slide is gone again. I'm gonna bring back my pen. Okay, so we're back. So we have the false positive rate, and we also have the true positive rate on the y-axis, false positive rate on the x-axis. And you're going to plot this, and you do this for different groups. So that we have the green group and the orange group. Let's say the green group, the orange group is female. So the orange group is male, because I was using A for male in the previous slides, and this is female, okay? Oh. Okay, I'm gonna fix this again, just to avoid any confusions. Yeah, so this is male, and this one is female. Okay, so what you would do is, so D is the threshold of the score function R, and the error rate parity implies that the ROC curve of score conditional on group must be under all curves. So basically what you want to do is you plot all, for all the groups, you plot this ROC curve, and the intersection of the curves, or basically the area under all curves, is going to be the part that where, the outcomes is going to be balanced for everybody. Okay, so this is a slightly better approach and also established method for debugging outcomes based on false positive and false negative rates. Sorry, false positive and true positive. The third statistical fairness criteria is called calibration. Calibration, just like when you calibrate machines and so on, right? So the score R is calibrated if the probability of the outcome Y when the score is R is exactly the score R, okay? This might sound a little less intuitive, but we're basically pretending that the score is a probability because you can put the score between 0 and 1, and we're not too far from what a probability is, although it may not actually be a probability, right? So the score value R corresponds to what we call a positive outcome rate R. And the calibration by group is going to be the probability that the outcome is Y given the score R, and the group, the person is coming from group A, for example, male, is R. So basically what we're doing here is Y is independent of A, conditional on R. So we're conditioning this on the score to create or to balance between the outcome, the score outcome for different groups. And like error parity rate, which is a post hoc guarantee, here, post hoc criteria, calibration is a pre hoc or an a priori guarantee. So the decision maker basically sees the score value R and knows based on this what the frequency of positive outcomes is going to be. For instance, a 0.8 score means 80% rate of heart failure on average over people who receive this score of 0.8. So this guarantee that you have does not hold at the individual levels. For example, just the fact that you have this average 0.8 score per group doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, a person named Mary has an individual risk of heart failure of 80%, right? This may not translate to individuals. So one way to do group calibration is to do this notion of constrained learning, where basically the deviation from satisfying the group calibration is going to be upper bounded by this excess risk of learned score relative to techniques like the bias optimal score function. And in other words, what we're saying here is you shouldn't be surprised to see calibration follow approximately from this unconstrained supervised learning. So this is a plot of scores, the deciles of scores from 0 to 10 on the x-axis, and the rate of positive outcomes for male and female. So the green line is female and the blue line is male, and this is about gender. So the calibration is happening, and as you can see, as we proceed through the score deciles, the calibration is following more or less a straight line, and it's there's two lines, the green and the blue line, are more or less, on the same path. So you don't see a big off divergence between the two. So this is a classic example of calibration where it follows from this notion of unconstrained learning. And by the way, this is on the popular UCI adult data set. When we talk about calibration between groups, we should also be mindful of the fact that subgroup fairness is very important. And here is an example where we could have blind spots when we do this calibration technique. So over here on the right, what you have is data of male and females, right? So male and female. So vertically, what is on the left is males and what is on the right is females. But horizontally, when you look at the data, each data of it, the population of data for male and female is further divided into blue and green points, right? And what we have in red circles is accepted individuals. So from the blue region, the blue circles, you have accepted 5 people. And from the green circles, you have also accepted 5 people. So on the surface, the acceptance is equal, 5 from each group, from male and female. But the issue is when you look at the subgroups, right? The blue subgroup in male and the green subgroup in male, you only picked 5 data points from the blue subgroup over here, and you only picked 5 data points from the green subgroup for the females, right? So basically, ensuring fairness criteria between 2 groups can lead to violations within subgroups. So this is actually a violation. On the surface, this looks balanced, but internally, it's not. So this actually motivated work on ensuring what we call subgroup fairness. Okay. So if we have to kind of recap and summarize what we have discussed so far as statistical fairness criteria goes, so we looked at this fairness, equality of positive outcomes, which is R independent of A, so the score independent of a sensitive attribute or a protected class, R independent of A conditioned on Y, or Y independent of A conditional on R. So equal acceptance rate for the first, equal error rate or error rate parity, and the third one is calibration by group. Okay. Now, a very natural question that you might ask is, okay, this three criteria seem to address different issues, and they seem interesting. Can we have them all at once for a given model, for a given data set? The short answer is no. And the informal theorem that we can make is any two of these criteria are mutually exclusive in general. So if there is even a further, a bad news, right? So I said no in general, but even not three, when you pick any two of this, they are mutually exclusive. So you can't achieve them all, unfortunately. So let me expand a little bit on what I'm saying here as far as, you can't achieve them all, right? So error parity versus calibration, for instance. So basically what you're saying is you assume an equal base rates where the probability of Y being 1 given A equals some protected class, let's say male, is different from the probability of Y equals 1 when it is a different class like female. Then you also assume imperfect decision rule because D has always non-zero error rates, right? We're dealing with a sampling of some distribution. We've not collected all samples out there. So calibration by group implies that error rate parity is somehow, it's not gonna work. It's gonna fail. Okay, so now we're gonna transition into just looking at, what does fairness criteria look in the real world. So here is an article from 2016 by ProPublica entitled Machine Bias. And this is about a software that is used across the country by police departments, by law enforcement to predict future criminals. And the headline is, "This is biased against Black people." And this data is called the COMPAS data set. And what happened there, according to ProPublica, is there is a risk score called COMPAS and used by many jurisdictions in the United States to assess what we call risk of recidivism, which means the risk of committing crime again. And judges may basically detain defendants partly based on this score. Okay, so this is a very big, it has a lot of implications, right? So according to ProPublica, right, the investigative team that looked into COMPAS, so what they found out is Black defendants face higher false positive rates. So speaking of false positive, equalizing false positive, right? False positive rates, which means more Black defendants labeled high risk end up not committing crime upon release. So basically, Black people who were rated as high risk, when they are released, they end up not committing crime upon release than their white counterparts, which were equally or more or less equally rated high risk, right? Okay, so the maker of COMPAS, NorthPoint, the company behind this technology, said, they basically blamed it on calibration. They said, our scores are calibrated by group, and Black defendants have higher recidivism rate, or the rate of being, committing crimes in the future. So this is unavoidable, right? So they basically say, we use the state of the practice calibration method, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? So a word of caution about the COMPAS debate is that neither error rate parity nor calibration rule out any blatantly unfair practices, right? So the fact that you have used this error parity rates and calibration doesn't make you free of any blames, right? So what is fair in criminal justice is not settled by appeal to one or the other criterion. So it doesn't really matter. So, and more importantly, these properties are not meant to be fairness certificates, okay? So every time you use calibration or error parity, we're not giving a fairness certificate. If that was the case, it would have been super easy. You just look at the certificate and you make your decisions as a judge, right? Okay, so let me give you like concrete examples of why this is not working. So consider this two groups, right? The blue group and the orange group. The blue group is this group, and the orange group is this group. So what we're looking at is we have a detention threshold. So let's say we're going to detain everyone above 0.5. So these are the cutoff points, right? And we're computing the statistical data, detention rate and false positive rate, okay? So as we look at it here, 38% is the detention rate for the blue group and 25% is the false positive, 38% is, yes, 25% is the false positive rate. And for the orange group, 61% detention rate and 42% false positive rate. And in the spirit of the calibration and equality of error and equality of positive rates that we discussed, the three fairness criteria that we have discussed, things are not working out because when you compare the two groups, the detention rate is 38 versus 61. They're not even close. The false positive rate, the same thing, 25% versus 42%. So we have to do some sort of calibration to bring to narrow the gap between these two metrics that we're computing. So here is one attempt to equalizing rates, which could lead to undesired outcomes, right? So what we do is we just inject this low score people in this subgroup, okay, into the orange group and recalculate everything. So because we didn't touch the blue group, 38 versus 25 false positive rate would be there. But for the orange group, things would change, right? So from 61, 42 is to 42 is the detection rate. So it dropped. And the false positive rate dropped from 42 to 26%, okay? That might be a good news, but the overall effect of what is going on here is the fact that now we are going to arrest more low-risk individuals in the orange group. So it didn't come for free. It has some indirect, unintended or undesired consequences, right? So when we do calibration, although we could follow some statistical properties and try to balance the outcomes, like whatever we're computing here, in this case, detention rate, of course, it became much closer, 38 versus 42%. But the detention rate is still higher for the orange group, as you can see, because if it is 42% for a larger population or pool size, it means that we're going to arrest more low-risk individuals. Another issue with calibration is demonstrated here with sort of hypothetical example, right? So we have a threshold which says detain everybody above 0.5. So these are scores. So we're saying these are true probabilities of reoffending. So hypothetically, maybe we know them, but in practice, it might be really hard to predetermine this, okay? This just to assume that we know them for the sake of this demonstration. So what you can do is you can look at subgroups. For example, there is this subgroup over here, and there is another subgroup over here. And when you look at this subgroups, the average probability of reoffense is 0.4 in this subgroups, for the two subgroups, right? So what you would do is you would just go to the data set and replace every score with the average score that you computed, okay? And the implication of this, statistically, what we're doing is we're just giving everybody the average score of the subgroup they belong to. And there is conceptually nothing bad or malicious about this. We're just doing some calibration. But the issue is now you're looking at a score of below 0.5 for everybody. So at the beginning, we were at this threshold where we are detaining people, there's 5 people above 0.5. But because of the calibration that we did here, and the calibration was not really intended to do anything malicious or anything unfair, there's just a statistical property where we're taking the average and replacing everything with the average. And now there is no one who's going to be detected, right? So you can see how consequential calibration and techniques like calibration would be, but the consequence may not be the desired consequence. It could be unintended consequences. Okay, so as a summary, we looked at statistical fairness criteria, the pros and cons of statistical fairness criteria. We started with covariates, outcome Y, and score R, and the status A in some protected group. So the fairness criteria give different answers to what we call equality of what question. And the three common criteria that we discussed are demographic parity, where equal acceptance rates in all groups. So say differently, this is the score are independent of the status A, membership status A, and the error rate parity is R independent of A given Y, and predictive parity is Y independent of A given R. Which is basically the calibration, the predictive quality is calibration. Okay, so as you can notice, hopefully, the statistical fairness criteria that we've started with, somehow excited about it, about this criteria, they are useful, but they have their own limitations. You know, case in point is this example of calibration, where calibration might give you some unintended outcomes. So the question then is prediction, because everything relied on prediction and getting the score, is prediction a very narrow perspective, right? So there's this scholarly debate around the compass, and this was about tension between fairness criteria. But something that you can also equally consider is whether, data and measurement problems are there, right? Because like policing patterns influence variables such as criminal history and the likelihood to commit crime again. So maybe we are asking the wrong question. And how about asking this question, where when is the issue not how we predict? Because we seem to be highly obsessed about how we predict, but that we predict, right? So maybe the fact that we're predicting is the problem, not how we are predicting it, right? So this kind of shifts the focus of the lecture a little bit into basically debugging this focus on how we're predicting. And instead questioning, okay, should we be predicting in the first place? Or is prediction or a good proxy? And here is a concrete example that kind of speaks to this question of, why are we relying on prediction as one important proxy? So there's this notion of failure to appear in court when, the court sends you a subpoena and you don't come. Okay. So one approach is you can predict failure to appear and jail if the risk is high, right? Take some legal consequences. And some, jurisdictions try to use this in the United States. But the alternative could be to recognize that people fail to appear in court due to, let's say, lack of childcare, transportation, work schedules, or simply because they have a lot of appointments, too many court appointments. And instead, why not implement steps to mitigate this issue? So as I said at the beginning of the lecture, some of the mitigations, some of the remedies that we have for fairness issues might not be even technical. They might have nothing to do with tuning some parameters of the machine learning model or playing with the metrics that we compute. They're purely policy or social services kind of mitigations. And this actually happened in the real world. There was this case of Harris County in Houston, Texas, where there was a ruling against the county. So the judge basically ordered this requirement that the Harris County to provide free childcare at courthouses, develop a two-way communication system between courts and defendants, give cell phones to poor defendants, and pay for public transit and rideshare services for defendants without access to transportation, right? So we could take this kind of measures that have nothing to do with the technical underpinnings of the machine learning models, but this could solve the problem. This could, reduce the issue of fairness to a larger degree. Okay, so that brings us to shifting towards what we call a broader perspective of fairness beyond just the statistical fairness criteria. Okay, so the statistical fairness criteria is narrow. How do we take salient social facts and context into account, right? So what happened here is taking context and salient social aspects into account and coming up with a solution. That is not technical, but even better than the technical solution. Okay, so the typical decision-making or learning setup that we are used to is this, right? So we have data, we have a learning process, we produce a model, and we are gonna give inputs to the model and make decisions, right? What we're interested in and what we wanna fill as a big gap here is there's something missing here, right? There's definitely something missing. I actually articulated this. Ursula Franklin actually articulated this idea some 30 years ago. So what she said is technologies are developed in and used with a particular social, economic, and political context. They arise out of a social structure. They're grafted onto it. They may reinforce it or destroy it, often in ways that are neither obvious and neither foreseen nor foreseeable. So this is a very powerful articulation. What she's saying is technologies are not developed in isolation or in vacuum. They are embedded, weaved into social, economic, and political context. So you cannot really say, okay, a computer is purely a technology, or an AI model is a purely technology. Every technology is associated with the social, economic, and political context. And every time we try to kind of isolate technology or try to pretend that technology is neutral to social, racial, economic, and political contexts, we get it wrong, okay? So that's a very important statement or observation. And the other thing that Ursula says, she goes on and also kind of makes this more solid, saying context is not a passive medium. So she's saying context is not a passive medium, but a dynamic counterpart, right? So what you consider to be the context today could change tomorrow, right? So you should keep up. So the responses of people individually and collectively, and the response of nature, including nature, often underrated in the formulation of plans and predictions when we use technology. And AI is not an exception here, if not a very important technology that we should be carefully navigating. So in light of what Ursula Franklin said, the fact that there are social, economic, and political contexts that are missing from the way we are doing decision-making using technology like AI, this should be the social decisions in the real world, right? So the data, the model, and the decision is what we carry from the typical setup of decision-making. Now we incorporate the measurement, the state of the world, right? The state of the world. We measure data, or we capture data, collect data, and so on, and we bring it here. And the decision is going to affect individuals. And individuals come from the world, right? So that there should be this end-to-end connection or interaction between the state of the world, the data, the model that we train, and also the decisions we make based on the model's output, and the impact on individuals, and the feedback mechanism should continue, right? So that's what we call social decisions in the real world. So that should be how we should be reasoning about fairness criteria in machine learning models. So there are two directions motivated by this broader perspective. So the first is, can we measure social context through causal models, right? So causality, the cause-effect notion. So what can causality say about questions of discrimination and fairness? The other is, can we formalize socio-technical systems using dynamic models? Because we're saying context is dynamic, it's not static. So how can we use this to reason about feedback and long-term effects, right? So I'll give you a brief overview of what we're observing as far as causal modeling and the dynamic models are concerned. So causal modeling and fairness. So there is this famous example of the UC Berkeley graduate admissions from the 1973, where there was an article that looked at sex bias in graduate admissions data from UC Berkeley. So the idea is the data shows, there is male acceptance rate of 44% and female acceptance rate of 30% among the top 6 departments. And obviously there is a huge disparity between the acceptance rate for male and female. But when you dive deeper into the data set and look at, the data by department and split it into the 2 genders, so the 6 departments A to F, and the men who applied, and the women who applied and admitted, right? So both groups. And when you look at this, it's not as bad as what this observation is saying, like the male acceptance rate is 44%, the female acceptance. So if you individually look, for example, men applied to Department A, 825 men, and then 62 admitted, right? The percentage of those admitted is 62%. But when you look at women who applied to the same department, there were 108 women, and 82% of them were admitted, right? So if you look at simply percentage, the percentage is even higher for women who applied, right? And you see this data kind of showing the same pattern everywhere you go. For instance, here, it is 60% for Department B for males and 68% for females. 37%, okay, this is a little low. 33, 35%. 28, 24, this is low. 6, 7. So on balance, it doesn't look like this is really bad and it's really against the other gender, like the woman here. So the observation that was made by the article that went through this data set is that the bias in the aggregated data stems not from any pattern of discrimination on the part of the admissions committee, which seems quite fair on the whole, but apparently from prior screening at earlier levels of educational system. So the bias is actually traced back to, how the educational system kind of filters maybe the 2 genders through the hierarchy of different criteria. So the observation is that women are shunted by their socialization and education toward fields of graduate study that are generally more crowded, less productive of completed degrees, and less well-funded, that frequently offer poorer professional employment prospects. So as you can see, the root cause of the bias is not really the fact that the admission committee is biased against women intentionally. And also the statistics on the surface doesn't really reflect what is actually going on. So motivated by this, Judy Pearl, the author of the book on causal reasoning, kind of articulated this in the book. So for example, taking department, gender, and admission as nodes and trying to create basically this connection, the causal connection between the entities here, the nodes here. So department choice basically mediates influence of gender on admission, right? So that's the Pearl's causal interpretation. So is, for example, gender a direct influence in this case, right? So the argument by Pearl is the discrimination is the direct effect of gender on admission, right? So the fact that discrimination is happening is the direct effect of gender on admission, at least as per the causal reasoning that is done. But when you look at this direct effect, so there are some normative problems with discrimination as direct effect, because this one roughly captures what we call disparate treatment doctrine among the 2 doctrines that we talked about in the law, and it inherits its pitfalls. In particular, this is defeated by what we call indirect discrimination, right? So what happened was indirect discrimination. So indirect causes can encode discrimination. For example, women choose not to apply to the department because for a completely different reason. For example, compensation is lower for women because the department policies are harmful to women, right? So absolutely, different reason for discrimination. And why do we think the department choice as a mediator basically disarms the concerns of discrimination, right? So there are 2 problems with causal modeling is an interesting development in terms of fairness criteria, but it's still work in progress. So there are two problems that are pointed out in the literature. One is what we call the ontological problem. So what is the thing, a node in a causal graph reference? Because depending on what you capture in a node, things could go either way, right? And the other is what we call the epistemological problem, which is how do we know facts about a thing, right? So you have a node, let's say a department or a gender, and then what is gender? What is race, right? So knowing facts around the node, and annotating the node is very important because maybe the reasoning should be around what describes this node in the causal graph. So you might wonder, should we give up on causal modeling? The answer is generally no, because this is still a work in progress. So we would see more formalisms in the future. But causality basically clarified issues such as confounding and mediation, but it doesn't really resolve what we call fair, okay? So basically, there is no causal fairness definition either. We don't have the statistical definition of fairness. We don't have the causal definition of fairness either. So, but causal modeling involving social constructs suffers from these unacknowledged, ontological and epistemological problems that are deep and challenging, right? So we need to address these two problems before causal modeling is, seriously taken into the fairness analysis. Okay, so we need to address these issues basically. And the other side of this broader perspective of fairness is dynamic modeling and fairness, right? So the question we're asking here is, do existing fairness criteria promote long-term welfare improvements for groups they aim to protect? So in other words, what we're saying is, you would consider context today, and you would rely on that context to basically provide the best fairness criteria that you have. But as Ursula Franklin pointed out, context is not passive, it's dynamic, it's changing. So we have to have fairness mechanisms that adapt, that cope up with this dynamism of the world, right, the context. So basically the setup is you have a score R decision rule thresholded by T and outcome Y. What we're saying is if the decision is 1 and the outcome is 1, this would improve the score. If the decision is 1 and the outcome is 0, this diminishes the score. But if the decision is 0, this will leave the score the same. So we need this kind of flexibility, but that kind of morphs or changes with the actual context, right? So that this long-term welfare would be maintained. So the fact that you've provided a fair, balanced outcome today doesn't necessarily guarantee a fair and balanced outcome tomorrow unless your mechanism adapts accordingly. So that's what the dynamic modeling is saying. And there's a lot to learn from socio-technical systems where this dynamism is, uncertainty is basically encoded in the design of such systems or dynamic systems. Okay, so in summary, fairness through an awareness doesn't work. A statistical fairness seems to be a fairly useful approach with all its downsides that we discussed. So demographic parity, error rate parity, and predictive parity or calibration, all those are useful, but we also looked at cautions around the issues that arise when we apply them. But statistical fairness criteria on their own, as we said, are not cannot be proof of fairness. And nor are fairness criteria on their own good objective functions, right? So we also briefly looked at causal modeling as a promising direction, but doesn't really define fairness. And dynamic models is sort of the setup that we should be focusing on, because as a social, economic, and political context change, and our fairness analysis or fairness mechanisms should also be changed accordingly. So these are useful in ensuring this long-term welfare for groups that we aim to protect. Okay, so with that, I will stop the lecture for today and see you for the next one.